Hi everyone, in this video we're going to talk all about gouache, what it is, how to use it, and the materials you'll need. So let's just get right into it. Gouache is a water media, commonly known as an opaque watercolor. You use water to thin down the paint, so it can be used thin and transparently, or thick and opaquely if less water is added. Typically you work from thin to thick, meaning you start with a very diluted wash of paint and gradually build up the opacity by adding less and less water. Because of its opacity, you can either work from light to dark or from dark to light. This means you don't have to preserve the light areas like you do in watercolor because you can paint it in opaquely at the end. This also makes gouache more forgiving of mistakes as you can cover an area opaquely to an extent. Like watercolor, gouache is resoluble, meaning you can reactivate dried paint. You can use a wet brush to re-wet paint you've laid down on paper or to reactivate dried paint on the palette. It's very easy to clean up after a painting session as all you need is a little bit of water. Sometimes I leave my workspace exactly as it is and come back hours later or the next day to continue where I left off just by reactivating the paint. Some other properties of gouache are that it dries to a matte finish. Because of this, gouache artworks photograph beautifully as there is no glare on the surface. A trickier property of gouache is that it dries to a different value. Light colors tend to dry darker, while dark colors dry lighter. While this is extremely tricky to get the hang of at first, it is something that gets easier with practice. Overall, while gouache may be described as some hybrid between watercolor and acrylic, it is unique in its own way for many reasons and it should be used as so. Its main difference from watercolor being that while it can be used thinly, it is designed to be opaque, and its beautiful matte velvety finish is what makes it so unique. Now let's talk about materials, starting with the paint that you use. Gouache most commonly comes in tubes. It is best used fresh out of the tube as it feels most creamy and workable when fresh. I'm using My Mary Extra Fine Gouache for all the demonstrations in the video. As for paper, watercolor paper works well as you want something that can withstand a few layers of water and paint. Here I'm using the Strathmore 500 series ready cut watercolor paper. 300 GSM is an ideal paperweight as it is heavy enough to reduce a bit of the buckling that happens as you paint. The texture of paper is up to personal preference. I personally like cold press paper as it has a bit of texture so you can get some nice brush strokes as the paint clings onto the toothier parts of the paper. For brushes, you can use watercolor or mixed media brushes. I like to use synthetic brushes. These ones here are by Princeton. I especially like these Princeton Aqua Elite brushes, which have very long bristles that can hold a lot of water, so the paint can go a very long way. An angular shader brush is great for blocking in backgrounds and is also versatile as you can get very thin strokes on its side. With round brushes that come to a thin tip, you can get very thin, precise lines, or with a bit more control and pressure, you can also achieve wider strokes. With more blunt brushes, you can experiment to create all kinds of interesting textures. And for even thinner lines, a liner brush is great as the paint can easily flow off the long bristles. Of course, there are many other kinds of brushes that you can try with gouache as it's all about experimenting. Some other things you'll need include a palette, 2 jars of water, a cloth or a paper towel to dry your brushes on, some tape to hold down the paper like washi tape or masking tape, and a spray bottle to mist your paints as you work. Because while gouache can be reactivated on the palette, it takes a bit more time and work to re-wet, and it's not the same creamy, velvety consistency as gouache that is fresh. Now that you know a bit more about gouache and the materials you'll need, let's talk about some basic gouache techniques and getting started with painting, starting with the consistency of paint. Here I've used black acrylic paint to just paint out a black strip. Then starting with a brush, I'm going to soak it through and just take off a little bit of moisture on a towel. And with a generous amount of gouache squeezed out onto my palette, I'm going to go into that gouache and just try and pick up some paint and paint over that black strip. You'll notice that even though I had a bit of water on my brush, the gouache doesn't spread very smoothly on the paper and you get a dry brush texture. So then you can start slowly adding in more water to the gouache mixture on your palette and you'll find that you'll reach this really nice creamy consistency while the paint is still opaque. But then as you add more water, you'll see that the paint starts to become transparent and it doesn't cover the black line that we've painted in. But keep in mind that some lighter colors are just inherently less opaque. For example, this yellow doesn't have as strong of an opaque covering power as a darker color. So when you're doing this exercise, you can pick a darker color to start with so you can more accurately see how opaque it is at the creamy consistency. The next exercise that would be helpful for practicing mixing up a creamy consistency is to try and block in one large area with just a flat shade of color. This will force you to squeeze out a lot of paint and mix up a large batch of the paint, which is good practice as you actually need more paint than you probably think you do. Something that tends to happen is you dilute the paint with a lot of water and the paint starts to become quite streaky rather than opaque. So if you start to see brush strokes in the paint, that's probably a sign that you could use a bit more paint in the mixture so that the paint can be more opaque. When it comes to layering, the basic principle is to work from thin to thick, starting with a lot of water in the mixture and gradually adding less. Because with thinner layers, it's less likely you'll lift off the paint from the paper as you continue to apply more strokes on top. This doesn't mean that you can't layer light colors on top of a dark opaque layer underneath. You just have to be a little more careful, and there are a few things that you want to avoid. For example, applying multiple strokes in the same area or using very long strokes and dragging it across the paint with a wet brush. The best thing to do if you want greater opacity is to let that layer dry and go over it a second or a third time. Here you can see that with the thinner layer, even if I use a lot of water on it, none of the paint gets lifted off the paper, whereas with the thicker layer, the paint easily lifts off with a wet brush. You can also use this knowledge to your advantage, as a good way to fix mistakes is you can try and lift off the pigment of the paper as it's still wet, or you can re-wet it with a wet brush and just soak it up with a tissue, and this will give you the best chance of covering that area with a lighter opaque layer if needed. Remember though that if you don't wait for the layer to dry first before going in with a second layer on top, then those two will bleed together. Although if you want things to blend, then that's the way you want to go. To practice your blending, you can first start with a color NY and just practice fading it out. So here I've got an ultramarine blue and I'm going to start with a dark blue at the top and just fade it out into a very light blue. I do this by just gradually adding more white into the mixture as I move down, and I make sure to keep up that creamy consistency, so I'm using lots of paint in the mixture while adding in water as well. Then at one point I'll clean off my brush and just pick up some pure white paint and bring it upwards into the dark blue, so that way I can get a smooth gradation. You can see that I just continue to sweep my brush back and forth until the color blends out smoothly. I also like to clean off my brush again, and you can go in with a clean brush and just slightly brush over any areas that you want to blend together a bit more smoothly. After you've practiced blending with just one color and white, you can move on to doing two color gradations. There are different ways that you can blend in gouache. One way is to block in half of the paper with one color and the bottom half with another, and where it meets in the middle, you can just use a brush to sweep over and blend it together. In order for this to work, you have to have a lot of paint on the paper so you have enough to blend with a wet brush. The way that I prefer to blend is to work from top to bottom. So I like to start with the first color and gradually mix in more of the second color into it on my palette and start to bring it down like that. As you start to feel more comfortable with blending, you can add more colors in and do lots of color transitions. Here I'm going from blue to purple to pink into orange. The important thing to remember is you want to blend while having a creamy consistency of paint, otherwise there's not much pigment on the paper for your brush to pick up and blend with the other colors. So make sure you're working in that creamy velvety consistency while you're blending. Now that you're feeling more confident with gouache and the basic techniques, let's have some fun and experiment with some other techniques, starting with some dry brushing. I like to start by just soaking my brush through and taking off a bit of the excess moisture, and then picking up some of the paint, and you can start to apply it onto the paper and see what kind of texture you get. Then it's all about just experimenting with the amount of water that you want to add into it. Too much water and you'll lose that dry brush texture. A good way to take out some moisture in the brush if you realize you have too much is to use a paper towel and soak it up around the belly of the brush. Once you get the hang of that, then it's time to practice painting against an opaque layer. The challenge here is to not reactivate that layer beneath, so you really have to control the amount of water in your brush. You want to avoid applying multiple strokes in the same place as you're more likely to reactivate the paint. The next technique you can try is the opposite of dry brushing, which is glazing, and this time you want to thin down your paint with a lot of water. I especially like to use this technique when I'm trying to paint rays of light, as it can look very convincing when done correctly. You might have a harder time trying to not reactivate the layer beneath, as your brush is going to have a lot of water in it, but it just takes a little bit of practice to get the hang of this. One of my favorite things about gouache is how I can easily make the colors bleed together. Here I've applied some paint onto the paper, and while it's still wet, I'm going to pick up a lot of white paint with a decent amount of water in my brush as well, and as I sweep across the edge of the paint I just laid down, the water is going to make the colors bleed together. I love to use this technique whenever I want to create a misty effect. You can also do this with paint that's dried on the paper as well. You just have to go in with a wet brush and just reactivate and soften out the edges. Let's explore some other textures you can create with your brush. Here I'm using a blunt round brush and gently pressing at the base of the bristles to make the hairs split apart, and picking up a bit of paint, I can now stipple on the paper to create a foliage-like texture. If you have too much water on your brush, the hairs will clump together, which will make it difficult for you to split the hairs apart, and at the same time the paint will be much more watery and you won't get that fine stipple texture. So again, you can remove some of the moisture with some paper towel just by taking it off the belly of the brush. This will make it much easier for you to split the hairs apart. The next brush I'm using is called a filbert grainer brush in the Princeton Velvetouch range. You can use it to create grass-like textures, as the hairs are very thin and split apart. You can have a lot of fun experimenting with this one to create all kinds of textures. Because gouache is opaque, you can use white gouache to sprinkle on stars. You can use a liner brush and just tap on the brush. You'll be able to achieve larger splatters while not getting your hands dirty, or you can use a filbert grainer brush or a fan brush and sprinkle on the stars that way. You get much more smaller, clustered splatters on the paper. Now we're going to put everything we've learned into practice and paint 6 small paintings. I'm going to start by taping down some paper with washi tape and splitting it into 6 small sections. These are the brushes that I'll be using for the paintings, and I've also picked out my colors as well. I'll also be using a spray bottle to mist my palette so that the paint can stay fresh on there as I work. For the first painting, I'm just going to paint in some clouds. So first I'm going to block in the sky, painting just a simple gradation from dark blue to light blue. So I'm just using some of the basic blending techniques that I explained in the second video. And before I paint the clouds on, I want to make sure this first layer is thoroughly dried. So I'll leave it to dry while I move on to the second painting. I switch to a round brush and mix up some green paint. I'm going to use a very thin diluted wash of this and use this to block in some rough leaf-like shapes. I'm going to paint a forest scene for this one with some sunlight shining through. So you can see I'm working from thin to thick, and then I'm going to go in with a stippling technique and just stipple on a bit more of the foliage texture with paint that's a little bit thicker. Now that the first layer has dried in the first painting, I'm going to go back to it and use a dry brush texture to sweep on some clouds. I'm just using pure white paint with a dry brush, and I'm applying it in quite thick strokes, so I'm getting a nice texture. When I want to build up the opacity of the white, I wait for it to dry and go in with a second layer on top. I concentrate that towards the center of the cloud so that the edges can look a bit more transparent and wispy. And that's the first mini painting done. Now my second painting has also dried, so I can go in with another layer of thicker, more opaque paint. I'm painting in the tree trunks and the branches using black mixed with some burnt sienna, and then I stipple on a bit more foliage texture on top of that. Once that layer has completely dried, I'm ready to go in with some really thinned down yellowish orange paint and paint on the rays of sunlight that are shining through the forest trees. So I'm using a glazing technique to very gently glaze on that light yellow over the top. You have to take a lot of care here to not overwork the paint beneath, as you can easily start to reactivate those darker colors with your wet brush. After cleaning up some palette space, I mix up a blue-grey using ultramarine blue with a bit of black and lots of white. And I'm going to paint in a misty mountain scene for this third mini painting. My aim here is to get the bottom of the mountain to bleed as much as possible so I can create that mist effect. I have to be very careful though to let each layer dry before I stack the next mountain on top of it, as the paint is very wet on the paper, and if I try to go in with another layer, it's going to bleed together where I don't want it to. I'm quickly blocking in the first layer for the last 3 paintings so they can all dry while I work on the other one. I'll be painting a forest scene looking upwards in the 4th one, a galaxy night sky in the 5th one, and a grassy field in the last one. I'm using a dark green to quickly block in where I want the trees to be, and then I'm going to switch to a stippling technique so I can create more of the foliage texture. I also mix in more yellow for some of the lighter areas, and I just continue to build up that texture on the paper. Then once that layer has dried, I paint in the tree trunks. They get thinner as they converge into the center of the painting. Even though I'm using a size 6 round brush for this tiny painting, I can still achieve some very thin lines because it comes to a very pointy tip. I quickly paint on a bit of land in this 5th painting, and then I have some fun sprinkling on the stars in the sky. Then I paint in a few shooting stars using a size 1 liner brush. I can get some really thin and precise strokes with this. For the grassy field, I first block in the base color using a very dark green and just bringing it up into a lighter green. Then it's time to make the most of this brush and bring out as much of that wispy texture as I can. I layer from dark to light, gradually building it up towards the front of the painting. The best part is always removing the tape to reveal those clean edges and to see your finished piece. I hope you enjoyed watching this short introduction to gouache series, and I hope it also made you want to try out this fun and exciting medium. It can take a little bit of time to get the hang of it, but I promise it's so much fun when you do. Thank you so much for watching. Bye bye.